I'm very excited for this program. So thank you for joining us for Why Ban Books. Dr. Emily J. M. Knox is an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include information access and intellectual freedom and censorship. She is a member of the Mapping Information Access Research Team. So if you have questions, please put those in the chat at any time. And Emily will actually get to those during the program or when she's able. So thank you for joining us.
Here, I just needed to clean my glasses.
No worries.
Hi, so thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk today about book banning, which has long been an interest of mine. So I just call this talk Why Ban Books. It's actually what I have been studying since I started my doctoral program in 2008. And it's always been an interest of mine. So my mom was a high school librarian for 32 years. So we always observed Banned Books Week. And she would bring home the list of the top banned books of a particular year, and I would often do my book reports on those books. Judy Blume was one of my favorite authors, and I was always very upset that her books would be on the list. I don't know if y'all heard recently that they're actually about to make Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret into a movie, and it's kind of interesting. We'll see how that goes. So I started being really interested in why did people want to take these books away that I really loved. So when I first started school, I studied religion, and I did that through my undergrad and first grad school. And then I went and got my master's in library information science, and then I was a theological librarian. And I finally decided that, like, okay, I'm ready to do this. I'm ready to go and study why do people ban books. I just really needed help to think things through. So I will talk a little bit about that. If there's anything that I say that doesn't make sense, please let me know in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions about what I discussed here. So what we talk about in library and information science is really intellectual freedom. So this is actually from the Libraries Transform ALA campaign on library advocacy. So intellectual freedom is the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. It provides for free access to all expressions of ideas through which any and all sides of a question, cause, or movement may be explored. Censorship is basically its opposite. Censorship is the suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous. So these are definitions from the American Library Association, and I really see these as being based in ideas about how do we understand the process of reading? What does it mean to read? So intellectual freedom isn't just one thing. There are lots of different issues, and I know that the text on here is small, so I'll read through it a bit. So one is legal. This is what people talk about quite a bit. Actually, we have some legal cases that are going to before the Supreme Court about First Amendment law, and I'm very curious to see how those will turn out. We have not had a lot of First Amendment, individual First Amendment law cases before the Supreme Court anytime recently. Also, people often talk about things like EU hate speech laws. The idea that there can be repercussions. For example, in Germany, you are not able to say, for example, that the Holocaust did not happen. You cannot engage in Holocaust denial in Germany. I also look at things like philosophical issues. These are things like ethics, justice, morality, also issues of neutrality. This is something that comes up in librarianship a lot. What does it mean to be neutral? Can you be neutral? Is that even possible? Privacy is actually one of the most important parts of intellectual freedom. You cannot have intellectual freedom if you do not have privacy. It seems like it'd be not super something that things that people think about, but how can you make sure that you won't have repercussions if you are not able to know that people are not looking over you when you're reading? So this discusses issues like records management. In most public libraries, there's no list really of what you have read unless you opt into that. Otherwise, libraries will make sure that you are disassociated from your previously checked out books. Access, so this is things like selection, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple of minutes. Classification, so where does something sit in a library? Challenges, we'll obviously talk about book challenges today. And then bibliography. I want to talk a little bit about bibliography because it's actually one of the most important things that we can do, which is to keep a record of the books that are being challenged at this time. I cannot stress that enough because it is part of our job as librarians, archivists, to make sure that we keep a cultural record of what has happened over time. So there are actually many books, some of which have just recently been put out, that shows what has been censored since books first started, for example. You can see how society has changed, what sort of things make people upset. And it's really vitally important that we keep work of bibliography going. Finally, policy development. These are things like codes of ethics, the Library Bill of Rights, and challenge policies. So actually, I thought I would show Deerfield Public Library's own collection development policy. I'm always interested in this because people don't really understand how books show up on the shelf. Libraries are often very magical places. So you walk into the library and there are books, there are movies, there are games, there are toys. How do they get there? This actually is just the beginning point. There's actually a series of steps that happens after you develop the collection development policy. So this is available on the Deerfield website. And basically it says that selection is critical and interpretive process. Materials are listed based on their content. You can read through some of this. It says that the following criteria are used: comprehensiveness and depth of treatment, artistic presentation, relevance to current and anticipated community needs. I have to say that what I really like here is local significance of the author or topic. That's actually one of the reasons why public libraries are so important. This idea that you really try to make sure that you have local issues of local interest within your collection. Also, the idea that works should reflect diverse viewpoints and inclusive experiences. That, of course, can be interpreted many different ways. What I tell my students is that they should really focus on representation and not balance. And this really speaks to that idea. Also, the challenge policy is down here at the bottom. So when I talk about my work, I talk about something called censorship practices. A lot of people try to say, well, that is censorship, that is not censorship, that kind of thing. But I would say that what I really focus on are what I call censorship practices. And these are practices that we all engage in. I'll just say for myself, for example, I do not read horror. I do not watch horror. I do not like to not be able to sleep at night. Those are basically restricted practices that I myself engage in for myself because I know what my own reaction will be. So when I think about censorship practices, I think about these in two different ways. They're active and passive practices. So active practices, these are the 4 R's, and that is redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So redaction is basically when you mark through something. So if you look at something like a classified document, for example, it will have like markings through it, and that is basic redaction. Restriction, on the other hand, that is when you are saying, in order to look at this particular thing, you have to go through some sort of process. So either you have to ask the librarian for it, you have to go through a permission process, those sorts of things. Relocation is really important to think about in terms of audience. So, for example, say that there is a book and the audience that is intended for that book is of a certain age. So often in libraries, there is a juvenile section, right? So that's J. So the author intended it for J, but someone says, I don't think this is actually a J book. I think that this is not appropriate information for people who are in the J section. I think this should actually be a YA book, right? But the important thing about that is not necessarily what the author intended or how, for example, people in general think about that particular book. Finally, removal is an active practice that most of us think of as censorship. That's really when you're just saying, this cannot be on the shelf at all, right? That would be the censorship practice that I call removal. So these are the active practices: redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So someone asked a question about what percentage of all new books can a library like Deerfield add? Very, very few. The number of books that are put out every year is just on an order of magnitude that we can't really imagine, especially if you think about things like all of the digital books that are put out every year. And that's just books, right? I'm not even talking about something like video games, CDs. Well, I guess that's a lot of that's digital right now. All the other materials that a library might have. This is why we have a selection process. And that is why you have criteria for selecting particular books. So you look at what your budget is, and you say, what fits into my budget and is within the selection criteria. So that's really how you make those different decisions. And they're often based on also the accessibility. Are you part of consortiums? So that's working with other libraries on collection. There are a lot of different ways that libraries make those collection selection policies and make those selection decisions, but they're almost always based on particular criteria that make sense for the mission of that particular library. So passive practices, these are things like self-censorship or bias. So self-censorship would be something like, I'm worried that people will be really upset about this book, so I'm not going to buy it, right? Or I'm worried that people will think that something of me personally, right? So I'm not going to do that. This is also an issue of when it comes to, say, writing a book. Bias is something like, I don't agree with this person, right? I think that their viewpoint is something that doesn't make sense or is anti-scientific or all sorts of things, and therefore I'm not going to buy it. So that's really why it's important to have those good collection development policies that have been through a process that people agree to, and thinking through, okay, does this actually work within our selection criteria? When you think about it that way, it both like makes it so you are not so subject to self-censorship and bias, and also you can talk to other people about it. You can say, these are what our criteria are. What do you think about this book? So what I study in my work is something I call the discourse of censorship. Basically, what I mean by that is how do people justify engaging in censorship practices? So even more basically, how do people justify wanting to get a book off the shelf? Because that's not really how we think about things in general in our country, right? We talk a lot about freedom and liberty. So when you're going to justify removing something, you have to think about a certain type of way you are going to argue for that. So I call that the discourse of censorship. I look at relationships that people use based in power, identity, and the nature of knowledge. So basically what I mean by that is people will say things, well, I'm a parent, which is really an identity. And I have a say in what goes in the school, which is something about power. And therefore, I want this book to be removed. And when you say something like that, you're thinking about what is the outcome that might happen if someone engages with this text. This picture, just so you know, this is from the McMinn County School Board. This is where Mouse was removed, and this is the actual board meeting after Mouse was removed. You can't even see all the people that were there. There was an overflow crowd, and this is very common. When books are removed, you have many, many more people engaging in the civic process, showing up to board meetings, talking about the books, because people are very passionate about books. So that's one of the things I look at as well. So I talk about this in the idea of controlling knowledge. So just so you know, how do book challenges usually work? Basically what happens is a book is identified and someone might say, like, I feel this book is inappropriate. And so they might go to the librarian and say, I think this book is inappropriate. Librarian would say, usually, often, well, hopefully we can find something else that works better for you. That's actually the best way. And hopefully you can find something, every book its reader. And then you can, but if that doesn't work out, you can fill out a request for consideration. Sometimes there are meetings, sometimes there are committees. And then if that's not resolved, it often goes to the board. Sometimes there's a hearing. And this is an example of a hearing on the Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian in Stockton, Missouri. And at that hearing, often the board will hear arguments both pro and con about keeping a particular book. And then often the board would have the final decision. There are different ways of doing that. This information actually usually shows up in library policies, so you can see how this request works. But I should say, along with this picture, we have also had congressional hearings about books. This is from Ted Cruz. This is at Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Jackson's hearings, and it's a discussion of anti-racist baby. I just really liked seeing this because it's such a familiar scene to me, which is somebody putting blown up pictures of a book on display so that they can discuss it. And it was just interesting to see that. What I'm really interested in, along with these arguments for removing books, is what is the point of this, right? What are people trying to achieve when they say, I want this book removed from the library shelves? In some ways, this is an entirely futile act. If you think about it in one way, books are available everywhere. You can buy them, you can torrent them, you can borrow them. There are just all sorts of ways to get a particular title. So what is someone trying to accomplish when they say, I don't want this title in my local library? So that's basically what my research is about. More technically, I talk about something called interpretive strategies and communities. This is the idea that you bring your own self, you bring your own baggage to the book that you read, right? So it's not that the book itself has some sort of meaning or ideas encoded in the book. In fact, you bring your whole self to the book and you get meaning that way. But it's not just you. Reading is actually quite social. So we are socialized as people to have certain ideas about how the world works, about how books work, and we bring that with us to the text that we're reading. So this is from Stanley Fish. This is actually a really great book called Is There a Text in This Class? He calls these interpretive strategies. So interpretive strategies is the baggage that you're bringing to the book. And then interpretive communities are people who share certain strategies when they read. I'm showing this picture of the Kutztown Banned Books Club because it really shows how reading is a social process, something we don't really think about. We often think about people reading by themselves, but even if you're reading by yourself, you're often bringing what you learned about, say, reading poetry in 10th grade or something like that to the book that you're reading. So it's often what people had told you about something before. Maybe you read a review of it. That review is in conversation with other people. You are in conversation with that review. So if we think about reading, it's not just one thing. It's actually all of these different strategies that we bring to these written words on paper or digitally. So I study what I call reading practices. I basically look at how people have understood reading through time and how it influences our understanding of reading now. This is just a bunch of pictures of different people reading over time. I often start in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is actually very important for thinking about book banning now, which I think sounds a little strange, but is very true because before the Middle Ages, people only read out loud. They did not read silently. The change to reading silently has major implications for the privacy aspect of thinking about intellectual freedom, right? If you're reading silently, no one knows where you are in the text. And actually, this has been even more heightened by digital readers. So if you're reading in your Kindle, no one knows what you're reading, and they definitely don't know where you are in the text. What they found, and what researchers found, is that actually there was a huge increase in romance sales when digital readers like the Kindle became more popular because no one could see that you were reading a romance. This might seem just kind of, some sort of interesting anecdote, but if you think about that in terms of what do I feel in terms of social negative outcomes if I'm reading something, right? The idea that no one knows what you're reading, and if you're reading silently, no one can intervene. This actually comes from the Middle Ages. I look a lot at the Reformation era. So just really simply, the Reformation era brought a change into how we think about books. Because what the reformers like Martin Luther said was that if you read this book, the Bible, you will find salvation. That is actually a very large claim, right? And it's one that didn't really exist before. But they said there's nothing between you and your salvation, your heavenly salvation. You can find this out for yourself by reading this text. That really gives a lot of power to books. So yes, they were just talking about the Bible, but in fact, what I see in my work is that this has come to talk about many different types of texts and different ways that people read. So if you're interested, there's two different doctrines for that. There is sola scriptura, which is by scripture alone, and then also the priesthood of all believers, which is this idea that no one stands between you. But in fact, the reformers were very worried about this. They were worried that people would still interpret the Bible wrong. So they started writing basically interpretations in the margins of the text or entire books dedicated to interpreting the Bible. So this has always been an issue. It shows how fraught the act of reading is. In the more modern era, what I talk about a lot is the idea that people have undisciplined imagination. What do I mean by that? Basically, I mean that there are certain people, mostly children and also sometimes women, who are not able to stand back from the text. So if they read this thing, they will do it. They will think differently. They will be different people. So a most obvious one is like, if my kid reads about someone using drugs, they will use drugs. It's this one-to-one sort of effect that people think about with text. It's because people, especially kids and women, are seen as being unable to keep themselves away from the text. Remember I talked about bringing your own baggage? This is part of the baggage, the idea that if I read about this, I will be different. In the United States especially, there's this idea that texts mean what they say and say what they mean. This actually shows up in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these words true to be self-evident, right? This is based in something called common sense Scottish philosophy. Doesn't really matter too much. Just way to think about it is that words say what they mean and mean what they say. So I hope you can see from this very quick dash through history that in fact, the way we think about reading, that reading is actually so much more complex and is based on all of these different ideas that we have inherited in the global north over time to think about what does it mean to read. And I should also say, like, it's not just the reading, it's also the book itself. So sometimes I ask my students, how many of you break the spines of your books? And often I get horrified looks. Sometimes I ask people, what if I put this book on the floor and just jumped up and down on it? I also get horrified looks. One of my favorite things is when we talk about preservation, there are all these books that have crumbly pages, and our preservation librarian will come in and rip out a page of a book and just crumble it up. And just the looks of horror on people's faces is something to behold, because books are not just regular objects, right? It's not like this can of soda I have right here. They are something else. They are almost sacred objects. And so the way people talk about this is that books should be true and truth should be in books. And this shows up all the time when people talk about banning books. So just keep those ideas about reading practices in your head as I move through this next part. So this is from 2021. You can find all of these stats on the American Library Association's website. Basically, this is the huge number of challenges that took place last year. We are on track to have even more challenges this year. Well, actually, these are 2021. We still are waiting for the 2022 numbers. We will see what happens in 2023. You can take a look at these and see all the reasons that are given for the challenges. Let's see if I can find my favorite ones. So one is like woke. That's always interesting. The books are racially dismissive. I'm sure you've heard these things in the news. So someone writes, so Martin Luther claimed that you reading the Bible means you're saved. Yes, it is very similar to how people talk about books today, that LGBT characters or conduct will indoctrinate or change people to be gay. It's really an idea about the power of reading, that It is the reading that is the trigger. I have an entire paper about the idea that reading can stir things up in people and change them as people, change their own soul and morality. That's not quite how it works if we look at individuals, but I think this is just a really important point when we think about banning books. So this is an example of a request for reconsideration. This is from Katy ISD, which is actually back in the news. This is actually an older one from 2016 for The Hate U Give. It has some common arguments that I see. So this is the idea that it has bad language, it has drugs, it has sex, therefore the book should not be in the this is in a school. That the book is only for people who are 17 years of age or older because the movie is going to be rated R. That's actually a very common argument. And I don't know how many of you have read The Hate U Give. It is about a young woman getting involved in the movement for Black Lives Matter. And it is quite a powerful book. And the people who are here say, we see no literary value to this book. I just found this today. Actually, this is another request for reconsideration. This is in, I want to say this is in Massachusetts. So this person went through all of these books to say what they were upset about it. You can see that some of the usual suspects are on here, although this is interesting to me that Colleen Hoover is finally showing up. This is the first time I've seen Colleen Hoover on any of these. Lauren Miracle has been on this list forever. And of course, Hopkins, Green, these are some usual suspects. Sarah Moss has recently started showing up on some of these lists. But all the others are basically ones that we see quite a bit. So this person is upset about these books in the high school library, and they actually went through the policy to say why these books should be removed. So basically they say none of these books should be reviewed as a whole, as they are graphic, I think they mean have graphic depictions of sex as defined in this part of the policy and have no serious value for minors. Now, people might talk about different ways that these have value for minors, but I think it's important to see how people are arguing for these, for the removal of books. I think also really importantly is that this person is saying that if you do not remove these, you will be at risk of losing your educational license because these books are so dangerous. You can go to their board packet and find all this information online. I do also like to talk about this idea of how words can work. This is actually Words That Wound, Critical Race Theory, Assaultive Speech, and the First Amendment. This is actually from 1993, so this is actual critical race theory by legal scholars, especially Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with the term intersectional, is one of the authors of this book. So they talk about how victims' experience reminds us that the harm of racist hate message is real harm to real people. So I don't necessarily agree with everything that is in this book, but I think it's very important for thinking about how do we understand the way that words can work when we think about what I call discourse or arguments that people are using. And here's an example of, for example, how CRT has changed from what Matsuda and the other authors were saying to From No Left Turn. So they talk about racial justice, and these are all what they call CRT code words. The idea that racial justice under CLT can take the form of lower standards, and they use the George Bush term, the bigotry of low expectations, issues about racial sensitivity and racial sensitive training. and the idea that they argue that critical race theory is saying that whites are inherently racist and therefore require instruction. Issues about how to interpret the terms racial and racialized prejudice. I'm basically showing this because I think it's important to think about how do people make these arguments, because it actually shows up in this next slide. So this is from Moms for Liberty. This is against the Wit and Wisdom curriculum in Tennessee. And let's see if I can remember. Sorry, my glasses aren't going to let me see exactly where in Tennessee. But their main issue is really that it focuses on what they call very dark and divisive slivers of American history. It makes children hate their country and each other, and that they work together to amplify feelings of resentment, shame of one's skin, color, and or fear. So this has been a very common argument when we're thinking about not necessarily LGBTQ books, those have different arguments, but especially books that are about Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which have been targeted. What I find very interesting about this particular Wit and Wisdom and Moms for Liberty letter is that they discuss the idea of injustice as having a problem, being a problem. So remember I showed from No Left Turn, this is really showing how you use words in a way that might be unexpected. So they have a problem, they went through the entire curriculum, and they said, this is every time that injustice shows up and that it is not a good thing that our children are being taught about injustice. There does not need to be a text labeled critical race theory for its harmful tenets to be present in the curriculum. The evidence is present in the outcome, and this is the idea that it can make people uncomfortable. So one of the most interesting things that they talk about are 4 different books, one of which is Ruby Bridges Goes to School by Ruby Bridges. Now, Ruby Bridges is still alive. She desegregated schools in Alabama. I believe it's Alabama. Pages 2 to 3 of that book depict photographs of a neighborhood sign that reads, "We want white tenants in our white community." Pages 14 to 15 shows white people holding up signs that say, "We want segregation, we don't want to integrate." I think it's key to understand that these are photographs that they are talking about, right? They are documentary evidence of something that took place in our history. But they're also upset about this particular painting. Now, this is by Norman Rockwell, The Problem We All Live With, which depicts Ruby Bridges, remember, who wrote this book, walking to school with the N-word in the background. This gets to something very important, which is just the idea of how do we talk about our history? Now, this is someone, Ruby Bridges, discussing her own history. And basically what Moms for Liberty is saying, this history, your own history, Ruby Bridges, is so painful for our students that we do not want to depict it. I think it's, of course, highly amusing that they're upset about this Norman Rockwell painting. Norman Rockwell is, of course, one of our foremost illustrators, not a particularly controversial painter. He felt it was important to show Ruby Bridges walking to school with the U.S. Marshals, but somehow it's too much for people to say. And also, I think it's important to know, because I've had people argue with me, that someone is too young to learn about this history. But Ruby was only 5 or 6 when she went through this, right? How young is too young to learn about this history that took place in our country? This is just basically how I analyze the work. So I go through and I look at what people say. So I found that today, that the one I showed today from Delta High School. And I talk about things like the one story that, especially when you're discussing diverse groups, that one story is just the same as any other story. So banning the blue SI doesn't really do anything. Also the idea of restriction. So this is the idea that you can opt out of reading the blue SI. So basically, one of the major themes that I find in my work is the idea that people who challenge books, people who try to get books banned, are very concerned that society is very fragile. They are very concerned also that there's a sense of moral drift, that we have moved from a particular idea about how life should be to a new idea. They often use the language of spiritual warfare, which I'm seeing more and more of. That drifted away for a while, but that's definitely what is happening now, especially with books about trans kids. There's an idea that parents should set boundaries and that public institutions should support those boundaries. I actually didn't show that in the one I found today, but she talks about that explicitly. Also, I just want to talk about this book. This is a altered book. I love these. They're beautiful. They're the only way I can think of really how to visualize what it means to read, with like the ideas and pictures jumping out at you. So I talk about something called common sense interpretations, the idea that words mean what they say and say what they mean. Also talked about the undisciplined imagination, right? The idea that you will simply do what you read about. That's what happens when you read this book. There's no idea that like, maybe I'm reading this book to find out about people who aren't like me, right? I'd like to know more about what it's like to be a Native American kid who decides to join the basketball team, right? I'd like to do that. I'd like to read about it. I'm not necessarily going to join the basketball team when I do that. So I also talk about something called imaginative visualization. This is the idea that, you know, if you read something, it will just affect you so much, and that there will be short and long-term effects of this, that you might not only, for example, want to use drugs, but also in the larger scheme of things, that you will become a person who does not share the values of that particular parent. So these are some of the books that have been challenged right now. Some of these have been on the list forever. Raina Telgemeier's books and Lauren Miracle's books have been on the list, I think, since they were published. I Am Jazz by Jazz Jennings has also been on the list a very long time. Some of these are newer. All Boys Aren't Blue, Genderqueer. What we really see is that these are minoritized populations that are being targeted right now. And it's not surprising that that's happening. What is going on in our society right now is that we are moving from a white majority country to having a country that is no longer white majority. We are, in fact, decentering white heterosexual male subjects when we think about these books. These are not the people who show up in these books. There are many more books about people who have different identities than what you would call just the, you know, the subject that always comes up, which is your white heterosexual male subject. Let's see. So I think authoritarianism is an interesting idea because I think what is I don't think we've actually wrestled in this country with what we mean by fairness, justice, and accountability. We are just starting to. We're only 50 years out from the civil rights movement. We've just seen major changes to, say, the Voting Rights Act. We don't actually know what it's like to live for 100 years in a country where everybody has the right to vote. So when I think about like, what do we mean by fairness, justice, and accountability, what we see really is that people do not agree with what that means. What Moms for Liberty really says is that you are not being fair or just or accountable to my child if you make it seem like there is something wrong with our country. If my child comes home upset because they found out that in fact they are living on stolen land, and actually I remember this happening at elementary school when I learned about the fact that I grew up in Maryland, and in fact all the land that we were walking on was stolen. It was very upsetting to me, but it's also true. And my being upset about that is part of the process that can lead to fairness, justice, and accountability. So I think it's really this idea of like, how do we get there? And it's actually quite difficult, and you might have to go through times that you feel guilt, that you feel upset, that you are not sure how to respond. To me, that is part of the process, and that seems to me what they are not grappling with. So I just want to finish up by saying, what can you do? Read banned books. This is Jane Mount's wonderful illustrations of books. Probably some of you are familiar with these. Bibliophile. This is a list that you can start here. You can also just look up the Texas lists of banned books. There are 850 books from Representative Krause. He's in the state legislature down there. I'm sure you can find one of those books that you would like to read. Consider running for your library board of trustees. It is very important that library boards support intellectual freedom and the mission of public libraries, the missions of public schools. We must be more political and think about what is it that we need to do for our entire communities. It's possible that you would be the best person to make sure that the freedom to read is protected in your local community. These are different places you can look. So the Freedom to Read Foundation is the legal arm of the American Library Association. PEN America is really for authors. So if you write, I really encourage you to take a look at the work of PEN America. I'm the chair of the board for the National Coalition Against Censorship. PEN America and Freedom to Read Foundation are part of that coalition. The NCAC does work especially with kids and with art, so in museums. And also there's the Kids Right to Read project that is really quite wonderful for getting kids interested in their own rights to freedom of expression. Also United Against Book Bans, this is really from a coalition to learn more about how you can support if book bans happen in your local community. This is my favorite ALA Banned Books Week poster, that words have power. It really encapsulates what my research is, which is to think about reading, books, power. How do we understand why these things all go together? And they kind of just show up in book banning, right? How we think about reading, how we think about books, how we think about our communities, how we think about how values are transmitted through our communities. What do our communities stand for? So I just always end with this particular poster because I think it's really great. So thank you very much. This is me. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And I really appreciate you coming this evening.
Thanks, Emily. I just want to pop in and say that this was very inspiring. Thank you so much for bringing this to us tonight. And I was just glancing at that list of banned books. I believe that the Deerfield Library has all of those books in our collection, so feel free to check them out. What a great way to start. If you find a book that we don't have, you can also do an interlibrary loan request or purchase request. We do work with patrons, and we're sure to get them the books that they need. So. I don't think I see any other questions. But maybe we'll give it a minute. If you guys do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat really quick. And as I mentioned too, while we're waiting to see if you do have any questions, while we were just getting started, I mentioned that we have a program next Wednesday on January 18th. If you are a writer, this is going to be a great program. It's an in-person workshop, 2 hours long. So we're going to be able to dive fairly deeply into writing. It's 10 essential principles of story with Daniel Joshua Rubin. I was actually inspired because I was reading his book, and then I thought, oh, I was looking for a writing instructor, and then reached out to him, and he actually lives in the Deerfield area. I didn't know it when I was reading the book. So it was just kind of everything came together. So I think you'll enjoy that if you are a writer or if you're just kind of getting started.
Okay, can you share, I have a question. Can you share how you think community members can help support library workers who are dealing with book challenges? So there are a couple of different ways to think about this. If a challenge is happening in your community, go to the board meeting. And not just you, especially if you have kids, take your kids to the board meeting. Speak up in support of the workers and the books. What I'm telling people who work in libraries to do is to already have their support system in place. So if a challenge comes up, who can you call on? The other thing I've noticed is that there is a lot of reluctance on the side of supporting books to use the tools of social media. So people will say things to me like, well, Moms for Liberty just threw up a Facebook page and people joined it. There's no reason that you can't throw up a Facebook page and have people join it. I really hope we can get past this reluctance to engage. Moms for Liberty and No Left Turn, they are, people talk about them being AstroTurf. In some ways that doesn't matter, right? They call on their local communities. They have people show up. And people who want to support freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, and are against censorship need to do the same. So if something is happening, go ahead and pull a group together. It's really important to do that and not feel like somehow that's inauthentic. I'm not quite sure what the reluctance is. So I'm not sure about Mouse, but for a while, right after this happened in McMinn County, you could not find Mouse in on Amazon. And I was just at a library recently, and they said they had like 200 holds on Mouse.
I believe we have that as an ebook as well, but I'll have to double check. Okay. And if you guys have questions, you can always follow up with me as well. You get my emails all the time. I'm sure. I'm Jamie, the program coordinator, and I'm always trying to make sure you guys are informed. So yeah, feel free to follow up. Otherwise, this was great. Dr. Knox, thank you. I know you are very busy. There's a lot going on right now. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoy talking to people about this topic.